They're just wanting him out of office. They'll stop at nothing. We're seeing their true colors. I believe that the left has been this bad all along. And as a journalist, I was even aware in the 70s, as I was beginning my career, that a lot of these forces were at play in the culture and certainly within the political system and in academia. But it was kind of below the radar screen a little bit. And if you wanted to believe that it wasn't there, you didn't necessarily have to confront it. But Donald Trump has kind of brought it all to the surface. And I'm glad, because I think that we can clean it up. And there's so many things that need to be cleaned up. We don't have time in this podcast to talk about all of them.
It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Stephen Strang, and we're going to be discussing his book, God, Trump, and the 2020 Election, Why He Must Win, and What's at Stake for Christians if He Loses. Now, in most of the circles I run in, Stephen Strang needs no introduction, but I know he's going to be new to a few of the listeners, so let me take a moment to run through his bio. Stephen Strang is the best-selling author of God and Donald Trump, which was brandished by the president at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland in 2018, and Trump Aftershock, the president's seismic impact on culture and faith in America. Stephen is the founder and CEO of Charisma Media. He was voted by Time magazine as one of the 25 most influential evangelicals in America. He has interviewed 4 U.S. presidents and has been featured on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, CBN, and a range of other Christian and mainstream media outlets. Stephen, it's such a great honor. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
The phrase that has defined both Donald Trump's candidacy and his first term as president is "Make America Great Again," but even more than Donald Trump and his supporters wanting America to be great, why does God want America to be great?
Well, that's a good question. And in all of my books, but particularly in this one, God, Trump, and the 2020 Election, I focus on the spiritual aspect because as a Christian and as an evangelical Christian, I believe, of course, that that's most important, and it's rarely discussed in the wider culture, even in conservative circles. Even in Christian circles, they don't talk very much about what is God's will. But I believe that God raised up America to be a light to the world, and indeed it has been in a number of ways. First of all, because of the way that God has blessed Americans financially, we've been able to support missions around the world. But also, America is basically, while very, very imperfect, of course, is basically a good nation. I mean, what other countries have defeated foes, and they were better off after the war than before? Japan and Germany come to mind. Conquerors throughout history have enslaved the people they conquered or decimated the countries in lots and lots of ways. Of course, we've spread democracy around the world, and we have held in check all kinds of bad actors, even in the last 70 years or 80 years since the end of World War II. Who knows what the world would have been like if there had not been a United States? And there are those who try to pull America down and just try to make it one more nation and no better than the others. And even as there's a move to socialism, if America's not great, America's not going to be able to do the things that God has, I believe, the destiny for it to do. And I quote Christian leaders in God, Trump, and the 2020 election talking about how they believe there's going to be a great end-time revival, and that it's not going to depend on Donald Trump. I mean, he's just another man, but he is an awesome leader. He is a disruptor. He's disrupting the direction this country's been going in a long time in lots of different ways. And that's why I believe that America needs to be great and why I believe that God is in it. But really, the term in the title is just, in a way, it's a shorthand way to say the spiritual aspect of this. And the book has 3 parts. The first is understanding what's at stake for the country, including a chapter on why he might lose. And the second part is a section called Understanding Donald Trump. He is not like the stereotype people see. I have a whole chapter on people who know him. I interviewed him personally, and of course I opine about that. There's a whole chapter on promises made, promises kept. He famously joked that he's kept more promises than he made. And his critics sometimes question his character. Usually that just means they don't agree with him, but they throw out character in a way they haven't even raised with other politicians. But he has one character trait other politicians don't have. When he promises something, he does his very best to fulfill that. And other presidents, even presidents like the Bushes, who I supported, it was almost as if they didn't even try. And the final section is understanding the spiritual dimension. There have been Christian prophets, and I know that you and a lot of your listeners would understand that, who prophesied as far back as the mid-2000s that he would be elected not once but twice. And of course, with prophecy, we have to see if it comes to pass. I believe that it will. And there's also signs in the heavens. I go into that. There's a whole chapter on that. And foreshadowing in the Bible, there are those who have compared Donald Trump to Cyrus, the pagan king from Persia that God used for the children of Israel to go back to Jerusalem. And he's also compared to Jehu, who was not so well-known king, who was the one that brought down the evil empire of Ahab and Jezebel and returned Israel to serving the one true God. And it's just interesting to see how God uses people like that. And there's a whole chapter, I call it, God uses imperfect leaders. And Donald Trump's not perfect. Of course he's not. None of us are perfect. Our other presidents weren't perfect. Obama went around the world apologizing and said he wanted to fundamentally change this country. In a lot of ways he did. And I believe that Donald Trump is getting things back on track. And I believe that's why he needs 4 more years.
I would agree with you that President Trump has done a great job of getting things back on track. And not to say that we've kind of fallen asleep or gotten lulled to sleep, but it's time for Christians to get activated and energized and get ready to be a part of working to elect Trump for a second term. But in terms of the progress we've made, you'd mentioned you have a chapter on what's truly at stake. So what's really at stake for the country if Donald Trump is not reelected? What do we stand to lose if he's no longer in office?
Well, he's made a lot of change in terms of pro-life and the judges he's put on the bench in defending religious liberty around the world. He's deregulated all kinds of agencies, particularly the energy sector. And the other side, of course, the Democrats are going to run someone. But, this is more than just the Democrats. It's really the extreme left. They're talking about making us a socialist nation. First of all, they will undo every good thing that Donald Trump did. And number 2, I believe that they will actually persecute Christians in terms of criminalizing things that now we take for granted as our religious freedoms. There's already been attempts to try to criminalize teaching biblical morality, and this famous Equality Act, which passed the House but hasn't been put into law, was supported by every single Democrat. And it basically says that if you do not go with the politically correct definition of marriage, which can be between 2 men, 2 women, if you speak up against that, it's hate speech, and hate speech can be prosecuted. In other words, make it illegal. Now, we think that would never happen. But I saw something I thought was kind of funny and ironic at the same time. It was kind of made up of the left saying, these things will never happen, and when they do, you bigots deserve every bit of it. And that's kind of like what's been happening the last half century. You say, this will never happen, and then it does happen. And it's like, what's next? And I think that people are beginning to say, enough is enough. Christian people tend not to be as politically active. They focus on their families. They focus on their spiritual lives. They take a lot of things for granted because we've had a pretty good run in this country for generations. And people are starting to wake up and realize they have to go and vote. A lot of Christians stay home. And one of the reasons I wrote God Trump in the 2020 election was to wake up these people. I didn't write it for a group. I wrote it for one reader going into the voting booth and realizing that they have to vote, in this case, not only for Donald Trump, but the people who support him, because, we're seeing in the news with all this nonsense about impeachment, people are saying, well, if he gets through this one, we'll just impeach him again if he gets reelected. Impeach him on what? He hasn't had a chance to do a high crime or misdemeanor, but they're promising to do it. So as a result, we have got to give the Republicans a majority in the House to stop this nonsense. It's like they found a loophole, or at least they think it's a loophole. It's not really a loophole in the Constitution that says that a majority of members of the House of Representatives can define impeachable offenses for anything they think it is and vote out a duly elected president. And in the case of Donald Trump, it's not because he did anything wrong, because they don't like him. Because they don't like him. They were calling for his impeachment before he was inaugurated. Several of the new members of these radical leftist representatives that they call the squad, these four ladies, on their first day in office, they were calling for his impeachment. They're just wanting him out of office. They'll stop at nothing. We're seeing their true colors. I believe that the left has been this bad all along. And as a journalist, I was even aware in the 70s, as I was beginning my career, that a lot of these forces were at play in the culture and certainly within the political system and in academia. But it was kind of below the radar screen a little bit, and if you wanted to believe that it wasn't there, you didn't necessarily have to confront it. But Donald Trump has kind of brought it all to the surface, and I'm glad, because I think that we can clean it up. And there's so many things that need to be cleaned up. We don't have time in this podcast to talk about all of them. But one of them is we've got some pretty corrupt people in the highest law enforcement agencies in America who went after a duly elected president, and really went after him before he was elected, and used the power of government to spy on American citizens. I'm sure that people that are listening, if they watch the news at all, of course they know what's going to happen. And I'm hopeful, and I believe that Donald Trump, given 4 more years, will clean up a lot of this stuff, and hopefully some of these people will be held accountable.
It seems every 4 years as we head into the presidential election season, we see a lot of the same mainstream issues being brought up in conversation and in the news cycle. But in terms of what evangelicals really need to be concerned about and aware of as we head into the 2020 election season, what are the pressing issues that really need to be front and center for us?
Well, one of the main issues has to be our religious liberties. I quote somebody in the book as saying, in fact, I think it was Robert Jeffress, the pastor of First Baptist in Dallas, said he did not vote for a man who was living the perfect Christian life. He wanted to support somebody who would defend his, meaning Jeffress's, right to live the kind of Christian life they believe that the Bible tells us to live. And, you know, you can have all kinds of policies about trade with China and should we spend more on military or not, even questions about the border, which I think are very, very important. They could go one way or the other and life would go on. But boy, if we lose our religious liberties, if they basically criminalize Christianity, the broader culture has basically pressed the Christian viewpoint out of the public square. There are very, very few people in the media, in academia, certainly in Hollywood, who even espouse a Christian point of view, and it's ridiculed. The president of Chick-fil-A, Dan Cathy, said in an interview to a Baptist newspaper that he believed what the Bible said about gay marriage. And they have hounded those people, not only at the time, which was, back in, when was it, 2012 or along in there, but even in other countries, as Chick-fil-A has started to expand outside the United States, when they try to put in a restaurant at a university. And it was over an interview of something that was said. Yet all kinds of vile, vile, vile things are overlooked. The F-bomb is used with some regularity in the media these days. We would have never had that kind of thing, and I think it's indicative of bigger issues. And these are the kinds of things I try to bring up. As a journalist, I try to present them logically. I try to make the case for why I believe what I do. But my number one purpose is to try to motivate the Christian people not only to vote, but to get others to vote. That's why I wrote the book 10 months before the election. I struggled a little bit because, of course, there was so much that's unknown. Like, for example, we still don't know who the Democratic nominee is, so I sort of ignored that because my feeling is that any of them, whether it's Bloomberg, Biden, or any of them, would be sort of equally bad in terms of the trends. Some I personally feel would be worse than others, but, time will tell. And then, of course, this whole thing with the impeachment was just coming up as the book was finished and sent to press. I'm actually getting the books from the printer this week, and it'll take time to get them in all the bookstores. It will be for sale widely, like we say, wherever Christian books are sold. And Walmart will probably sell more than anyone else, Barnes & Noble, of course, all those. and people can also get them online. I like to encourage people to go to christianbooks.com because it's a Christian company trying to do the best they can, and they're doing an outstanding job, actually. barnesandnoble.com, and of course, it seems like everybody can easily go onto amazon.com. And the book is available in advance. I'm doing everything I can, including this comment, to try to encourage people to go and buy it in advance at Amazon. Then they ship it on the day it releases, which happens to be January 14th, 2020. And a lot of people who aren't in the publishing business like you and I are don't realize how important pre-sales are, because it sends a signal to the entire publishing world and the media that a book is going to be a big book or just an also-ran. I'm hoping that this book will have an impact. Part of it gives me an opportunity to do interviews like yours and also to do secular interviews and to bring in the Christian component and say, listen, even if you don't agree with this, you have to understand that there are millions and millions of people that think this way, and that these are things that are very, very important to us. And also, you need to actually think that maybe God is behind all of this, because there's all these things in the Bible, things I've already referred to. And I'll mention one thing that the few people that have actually read it, because, we've had some, advanced copies available for the media and other people. There are signs in the heavens, and as we approach Christmas, we all remember that there were signs in the heavens when Christ was born. The Magi saw a star in the east and followed it to worship. And there are signs in the heavens, and as a journalist, I give this disclaimer that I'm not real sure what all this means, but for me at least, it makes you go, maybe God does have something to do with this, and I'll just throw out a couple. The first is the day that Donald Trump was born, June 14th, 1946, was a blood moon. That means it was a solar eclipse of the sun where the moon looks red. And what does that mean? Well, it makes you wonder. And then if you go with 700 days after he was born, and I believe that the Bible has significance for different numbers, and 7 is a number of perfection, and that evangelical Christians at least pay some attention to. But 700 days after he was born, to the day, the state of Israel was born in 1948. Then when Trump was inaugurated on January 20, 2017, he was 70 years old, 7 months, and 7 days. And that just seems like too many coincidences. To me, it means that, well, maybe God is actually sending us some little signs that he is somehow behind this very unlikely leader who's very controversial, who tweets sometimes about football games and all kinds of things that you wonder why he's doing it. But, the man is brilliant. He's maybe one of the best leaders that we've ever had as president, and he's got a strategy for a lot of the stuff he does. And part of it is that he just keeps everyone off balance, especially the media. The media is just so focused on his tweets that they ignore all the things that he's doing. And I bring this out in the book too, God, Trump, and the 2020 election, that if it weren't for his tweets of the day, the left, they would have their hair on fire every single day over all the things that he's deregulating, the changes that he's making with environmental things. Now, he and I, and I'm sure all your listeners, we all want a good environment, but to my point of view, the environment's better off now than it was when I was in my 20s. I mean, the water's cleaner, the air's cleaner, some endangered species have come back. But there are some people that are saying that we should outlaw fossil fuel. I mean, what do they want us to do? Go back to the Middle Ages? You can't have cell phones if you outlaw fossil fuel. And what are we going to do, walk everywhere or ride a horse? Some of the stuff that they're proposing is just so outlandish that it defies logic. And I try to bring this out. I like to say that I try to connect the dots to help the reader see the picture of what's really going on and why this election, more than any other, maybe even more than 2016, although you can make an argument that that was a pretty important election, that they need to be involved, and that also God has a plan and purpose in all of this, and to try to understand what God's plans and purposes are and how that relates to each of us.
Stephen, one slight left turn here before we wrap up. Your team over at Charisma has been working very hard to grow your Charisma podcast network, and I know you have a show on there called The Strang Report. Would love for you to just tell us a little bit about what kind of content the listeners are going to encounter if they go subscribe.
Well, I appreciate that. We actually started the Charisma Podcast Network the same month that Donald Trump announced he was running for president in 2016. That's how I kind of remember the date. And we just passed 20 million downloads. My downloads this year are very, very close to passing 2 million. However, I'm also starting a new podcast the day after Christmas. It's called God, Trump, and the 2020 Election. And all of my podcasts that are focused on current events and on the upcoming election are going to be on that podcast, as well as the Strang Report, which is going to deal more with spiritual affairs and things that are happening in the Christian community. And we would love to have your podcast on our podcast network, so we'll have to talk about that offline. But it has just really, really taken off in 2019, and I think we've passed some kind of tipping point, and we're excited. For me, this is a brand new platform because my platform has always been print, first with magazines, and we have several magazines, and then with books. We published, our biggest author ever is Jonathan Cahn, who wrote The Harbinger, and the latest book, The Oracle. So thanks for giving me an opportunity to plug. We also have a website called GodTrump2020.com. It's kind of a short version of the book title, GodTrump2020.com. People can order it there. In fact, if they pre-order the book, like I was suggesting, and go to that site and give us the little number they give you, it's a fairly easy process. We will actually give them $90 worth of stuff, including the audio books for my 3 books, God and Donald Trump and Trump Aftershock, which they can download immediately. And then the new one, God, Trump, and the 2020 Election, they can download it as soon as it releases on January 20th. It would automatically be downloaded. And then they also get a subscription to my favorite magazine, Charisma Magazine, and that all adds up to about $90. And it's our way to motivate people to go online and buy the book. I mean, yes, we want people to buy it at Walmart, Barnes & Noble, et cetera, and hopefully they'll start to get a buzz about it. And, of course, book sales will grow over time. But it's really, really important before January 14th to try to get as many pre-orders as we can. So we set up that website to do that.
Well, and like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places you can connect with Stephen Strang and Charisma Online, and a link to where you can buy the book as well. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Stephen Strang. Once again, our book today was God, Trump, and the 2020 Election, Why He Must Win and What's at Stake for Christians if He Loses. For more on the book, a great place to start is GodTrump2020.com. Head on over there right now so you get there in time to take advantage of their fantastic pre-order bonus offers. And again, Stephen, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Well, thank you, and let's do it again.